Hello and welcome to Disheveled with Adam White. Today I'm going to do the first in my World's Finest Challenge, where I read Batman and Superman each day, and just get a feel for the origins of the characters. Um, I'm showing you Volume 3 because they originally put out the first two hardcovers of the Omnibus editions of Superman as two trade paperbacks each for the first volume and two trade paperbacks for the second volume. I got them on Kindle for like $5 a piece when they were on sale, which is like a huge discount from getting the omnibus editions. So I read them on there, so that's why I'm showing you this one instead of the first one. Uh, but I really enjoyed reading the origins of Superman. I'd never read them before. Uh, Very different character from what we know today. Uh, the first issue of Action Comics has like a one-page. You could sort of call it an origin. You just know he comes from a doomed planet, and then he has powers, and that's really it. I mean, I'm pretty sure they don't even call it Krypton. And that's all they show for his origin. And they just kind of go straight into Superman as a character. And later on in the first issue of Superman, they revisit that origin and kind of do the same thing again, but mention that he has uh, foster parents, but they call his mother Mary, which is definitely a biblical reference at the time, I'd say, because we know later on her name was Martha. But uh, so you really don't get an origin for him, which is an interesting thing because it's just something that they just, I guess, didn't think that much about, didn't figure it was that interesting. Um, and that's something that I think is what makes Superman today is his Kryptonian heritage and what he, what he does based on being a man of two worlds. And so I thought that was really interesting that there really wasn't throughout the whole first omnibus, at least, there was virtually nothing on his origin. Another thing is he does have pretty much invulnerability to everything, and that's, pretty much like it is today. Uh, he can't fly. He just jumps. They compare him to a grasshopper, if you can believe it. And he just jumps, and it's funny because you'll watch him jumping. He'll have two or three crooks holding in his arms, and he'll jump with them to scare them and jump real high and walk on telephone wires like a bird. And he just doesn't fly, which is really strange because flying's the first thing you think of when you think of Superman today. And another thing that he does is he leaps to buildings where, criminals are discussing their plans, and he just grabs a hold of the windowsill with his fingers and holds on to listen to what the crooks are saying. I mean, he's like almost like a peeping Tom when he does that. And so it's kind of funny, but it's just really strange watching him hang on to the side of a building when, the Superman we all know and love can fly. But so that I thought was really strange because he does that all the time too. And he can run at super speed. He's always out racing trains and cars, and so I mean he does have that super speed. Eventually, about halfway through, they give him X-ray vision, just out of nowhere. Um, so he does have that. Lois is introduced in the first issue, and she actually is a lot like she is today. She's just a hard-nosed reporter who uh, gets overlooked because she's a woman, and she's always getting herself into trouble because she's trying to get these big stories, and Superman usually has to save her. But it just she has a lot of the same characteristics right from the first issue of Action Comics that she does uh, even to still today. So Lois is an interesting character and always has been. And their original editor of they worked for the Daily Star, and it said in the first couple issues that it was in Cleveland, which of course is where Siegel and Schuster were from. So he was originally in Cleveland at the Daily Star, and so was Lois and the rest of the group. But and they had an editor. I think his last name was Taylor. I can't remember now. Uh, but it wasn't Perry White. So after a few issues, they just kind of refer to it as the city. And then as you get into the omnibus further, they start saying he's in Metropolis. So they just kind of retcon that just out of nowhere and say that he lives in Metropolis. And eventually it's called the Daily Planet instead of the Daily Star. They don't offer any explanation as to why that's different, or how he got from Cleveland to Metropolis, or why that it's the Daily Planet instead of the Daily Star now. About issue Superman number 7, they start referring to the editor as White. So Perry White does appear then later in it's towards the end of the first omnibus. So I don't know if sometimes back in the golden age people just didn't keep track of stuff like that, so they may have just accidentally called him White and then went with it. It may not have been a conscious change, but he, the Perry White we all know as the head editor of the Daily Planet, didn't show up till later on, and he was basically the same character as Taylor, but just with a different name. Uh, a lot of his stories, pretty much all of his stories, he's just fighting regular people. And so he has a distinct advantage over his enemies because they're all mobsters, or there's a couple of different times he takes on uh, the people that run orphanages that are doing bad things to the children, like making them slave labor essentially, and not feeding them right and all that. And so he does things like that and takes out the criminals that are running these orphanages. That, like I said, that appears a few times, and he's like always helping kids. And Clark Kent will buy circus tickets for 100 orphans to go to the circus. And I mean, there's always just little feel good things. So he definitely was a big blue Boy Scout, uh, even in his early appearances. So that's something that hasn't changed. Uh, and he fights mob bosses. Lex Luthor does appear in a few issues. He's just referred to as Luthor. And he has a knack of getting out of what would be deathly situations to anybody else, but he doesn't have any powers or anything, and he's kind of a mad scientist type. Uh, Quite different from the Lex Luthor we know today that got changed in the 80s. uh, to being more of the businessman than a scientist. Uh, but he's in it a few times. Uh, like I said, Superman fights lots of mob bosses, people that are, you know, doing a protection racket on small businesses, and he does that numerous times. It does get a little repetitive, um, because he is just kind of a more generic hero. He doesn't have any of that Kryptonian stuff to define him, and you don't know anything about his days in Smallville. Smallville's never brought up. Uh, and the fact that his parents raised him to be such a good person. And so you're lacking a lot of that backstory that shows up later in Superman. I don't know how much later, but Siegel and Schuster didn't feel that any of that was important. They just had a superhero that was popular and had some powers, and they just, they go to a town where everyone was mysteriously asleep. And of course, it was scientists being blackmailed. And but I mean, he always, they're like, oh, we're safe. We're in a steel room. And of course, he rips the door right off and opens their safe and takes their valuables and says, here's, the papers that prove you're a criminal. And I'll turn these over to the police. And uh, he does things that would be considered illegal as well, which is kind of interesting for Superman. I mean, he does a lot of breaking and entering. He does, he definitely just takes what he wants because he can. I mean, he's always doing it for the right reasons, but it's just still kind of sketchy for Superman to do some of those things. Uh, he also lets people die. He doesn't outright kill anyone, but like a criminal will be like racing at another car from their car to run it off a cliff, and they'll both run off the cliff. And Superman will save the good person, and the car with the criminals in it ends in a fiery death, and he'll be like, well, that's what they deserve for doing what they do as criminals. That's part of their life, so they have to, that's what they get, basically, which is a lot different from Superman today, because the current Superman would probably save both of them without much thought. But, they'll shoot him sometimes and the bullets will come back and hit him, and he'll be like, well, they made their own bed, they can lie in it. So people do die. One thing that reminded me of the Smallville television show is that there's one issue where uh, a sneak thief, they call him, is stealing from Clark Kent and is hiding in his room and sees him change into Superman. And he's like, I'm going to blackmail you. I know who you are and all this, even though the guy didn't know who Clark Kent was. But he leaves, and he ends up falling down the stairs and breaking his neck and dying. And Superman's like, whew, that gets me out of that problem. But that always reminded me of the Smallville television show, because every time someone figured out who Clark Kent had powers, they always ended up mysteriously dying. So that kind of reminded me of that. But anyway, Superman was a very different character. Especially the no flying thing really gets me. So I'm eager to find out when that happens. I'll be reading. I'm going to read the first Golden Age Batman next, and because I know there's a lot of really different stuff about Batman in there. But very different Superman from what we know, and it was really interesting to read, though. Siegel and Schuster did a good job with it, but like I said, he was kind of more of a generic hero because of that lack of backstory. So I'm eager to see when and if that shows up in the Golden Age. That may have just been a Silver Age thing. So I'm eager to continue with these. There's currently 7 volumes of the Superman Golden Age. It goes up into the 50s. So I'm going to be looking into that. I mean, I'm not going to do it every time, but uh, I'm going to keep reading on it every day as part of my World's Finest Challenge and see where it goes. I'll even try to read some newer stuff of Batman and Superman and see kind of the state of them today. Uh, but anyway, I've talked on long enough about this. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, it's definitely a different look at Superman. So if you really want to see his origins, I'd highly recommend picking it up the first omnibus. You really get a sense of what Superman was during the 1930s and early 40s, and I just thought it was really interesting. So I hope you found it interesting. I did, uh, which doesn't always translate in my videos, but uh, I appreciate you hanging out with me this week, and I will see you guys next week with something else. Thanks a lot.